Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Emmy Allison, also from Lyft Economy. Hey, Emmy.
Hi.
So our guests today are Todd Schifeling and Suntae Kim. Todd is an associate professor in the Department of Management at Temple University's Fox School of Business. His research investigates the organizational and strategic dimensions of sustainability, seeking to shed light on both the mechanisms that drive change towards sustainability and those that impede it. His award-winning work has been published in top academic journals and been featured in media outlets, including National Geographic, Boston Globe, Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and Vox. He also serves with the organizations and natural environment division of the Academy of Management, and he's a member of B Local Philly. Todd, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So excited to be here. I love this podcast.
Awesome. And Suntae Kim. Suntae Kim is assistant professor of management and organization at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. He studies how innovation emerges in the context of adversity. Specifically, Suntae studies how entrepreneurship and innovation can help address unfolding crises. For example, Detroit's municipal bankruptcy, the COVID-19 pandemic, etc. Also, revitalizing challenged locales, for example, Detroit, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, and uplift marginalized groups, for example, North Korean refugees and Nepalese immigrant workers. Suntae studies these phenomena using qualitative research methods with a strong focus on unpacking interactional processes. Wow. I'll have to ask you what that means later, Suntae. And Suntae received his doctoral degree along with Todd at the University of Michigan. Suntae, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited.
All right.
I feel compelled to disclose that Todd and I got to co-teach B Impact teams at Temple University, and it was very delightful. We served on the B Local Philadelphia board together, and then I got to co-teach a B Impact Teams session, and the first ever at Temple University, and it was quite delightful. So I'm really excited to have you on, Todd.
Yeah, that was awesome. I'm forever grateful to Emmy for that, to give me the courage to do that and to make it such an amazing semester to get started with that at Temple. And since then, we expanded into like a regular class from an independent study and brought on more projects. And so it's been amazing to work with you.
Yeah, I think we should probably plug that a little bit at the end of the episode too, the other B Corp clinics going on.
Awesome. Well, to frame this up for listeners, we've invited Todd and Suntae onto the show because they've been studying the B Corp movement for many years. Actually, as a side note, the first time I found out about their work was in 2016, actually. There was an article you all did. I think it was Why Companies Are Becoming B Corps in Harvard Business Review. And Todd and Suntae have published a number of articles. And the one we're going to talk about today, which was published in 2024, was entitled The Paradox of Growing as a Values-Driven Company, Insights from the B Corp Movement. So today we'll be exploring what that means for the B Corp movement and beyond. And we're excited to dig in. So maybe, Suntae, to start, can you share a bit about your background and how you first got into studying business movements and the B Corp movement in particular?
Yes, I started my PhD in business at the University of Michigan because I was really interested in these alternative forms of businesses that are not just maximizing, shareholder values, but also pursuing other values such as social and environmental values. And I was really excited and obsessed with the topic. And then my advisor, Jerry Davis, introduced me to this emerging, fledgling movement of B Corporation. And he highlighted that movement because we were looking for empirical context where we can run some statistical analysis. And back then, social entrepreneurship was still very much like an emerging phenomena. So there was not a lot of database of many social enterprises. And B Corp was actually one of the very few examples. So we scraped all the data from the B Lab website, which was much smaller back then. And then back then it was only American movement. So that's how we got to start this research project.
Excellent. And Todd, what about you? How did you come into contact with the B Corp movement and maybe anything in your background that's helpful context for folks?
Yeah, so I was doing a sociology PhD at Michigan with Suntae, who was in the business school, and I was studying social movements. I was studying economic sociology. And when Suntae started telling me about this project, I got really interested in it from that perspective of what does this mean for there to be a social movement that's trying to change the economy? It's a social movement that's made up of businesses, and they have this declaration of interdependence. And I got really fascinated about the varying reasons that companies, the varying grievances that they had and that they were citing in terms of why they were becoming B Corps. The problems that they were diagnosing with the economy seemed to be pointing in contradictory directions, that some of them were saying capitalism is broken and there's these like big companies are causing so many problems. And some of them were saying like capitalism is full of phonies, like there's too many people claiming to be doing good stuff that aren't really. That's what really sparked my curiosity, is like, how is this movement composed of these two different perspectives that didn't seem to quite align?
Cool. Could you tell us a little bit about what led you to like asking the questions that you ask and what you're trying to answer in this article, The Paradox of Growing as a Values-Driven Company?
Yes, so actually this opportunity made me do the time travel back to 2009 when I started this project. And at the very beginning, the question was like, where do these B Corps emerge? And as a way to answer this question, we looked to the industry environment, especially the environment of large corporations and what they're doing in terms of sustainability. And that was my second year paper in the PhD program. And that initial statistical analysis resulted in a pattern that required explanation, because we were finding that both evil behaviors of corporations and also good behaviors of corporations, both of them were predicting the emergence of B Corps in that particular industry. Evil behaviors meaning, corporations laying off people, corporations don't contaminate the natural environment. Good behavior meaning corporations doing CSR, corporations claiming that they are making social and environmental contributions. And both of these variables were predicting the number of B Corps in the industry. And that was quite puzzling for us. So then we got into B Corps themselves and looking at some of the founding B Corps, the early B Corps from 2007 to 2010, I believe. And we read through every reason that they reported why they became certified as a B Corp. And that work showed a pretty clear pattern that there were two reasons that Todd was talking about earlier. One group of B Corps were certifying because they wanted to, they are responding to these evil behaviors by big corporations. They're trying to transform the capitalism, right? And another part of the movement is composed of these B Corps who are responding to actually good behaviors of corporations. And they are saying what they are doing, what the big corporations are doing is not really authentic. And we are the authentic social enterprises who are pursuing social and environmental values. And B Corp certification is really a stamp of authentication. So that was a bit of evolution that led to our HBR article that Ryan was talking about, why companies are becoming B Corporation.
Yeah, I think I could connect just a few more pieces there, which is that the HBR article is actually the end result of a years-long journey, a years-long investigation that Suntae was describing. And our reviewers kept pushing us like, what does it matter? Why does it matter? What is the ultimate impact of having these different grievances in the movement and stuff like that? And so we kept searching, we kept researching, investigating, pulling on that thread. And where we ended up was that the B Corp movement seemed quite distinctive from other movements that we called market alternative movements, other movements to challenge conventional practices in the economy and promote more positive alternatives that ran into a lot of dead ends or limitations. And the more we thought about it, the more we realized that there was a lot of things happening that seemed very distinctive or unique to the B Corp movement, and that they had navigated these pitfalls much more successfully. And that's what led to the HBR article, was trying to kind of distill those observations.
Interesting. Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about those other market alternative options and like what other market alternatives are you looking at and what are those sort of distinctive, what is distinguishing B Corp from those other market alternatives? Sorry, I guess I could specify.
Yeah, go for it, Suntae.
Yeah, so in our paper, we were referring to other market alternatives, such as fair trade movement and also microbrewery movement. And I'm talking about these two examples because they represent two contrasting poles of how market alternatives could evolve. I'm talking about a fair trade movement because they were one of the earlier market alternatives and they really pursued expansion and they achieved expansion by incorporating incumbent organizations, the large corporations, Starbucks and Nestle. And by doing so, they actually were criticized for being co-opted by the mainstream organizations. And some of the earlier members of the movement actually left the certification scheme and they created their own schemes. So that was the case of co-optation. And I was also talking about microbrewery movement because it was the case of marginalization, because they were really trying hard to, preserve their authenticity. And they were actively, guarding their movement from infiltration of large industrial beer companies. And as a result, they still remain as a movement, but still remain at the margin or at the periphery of the movement, still not fully penetrating into the mainstream of the industry. So we were comparing B Corp movement to those two alternatives. And Todd will be able to tell you how B Corp is different from them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we saw these two pitfalls of kind of dilution or co-optation and marginalization or being trapped in a niche. And, to be fair, like some movements, that might be the realization of their goals, but they're limited outcomes in the sense that neither of them really achieved transformative changes in the market, either because they became so diluted or because they never reached beyond a marginal position in the market. And yeah, so we were struck. The more we dug into how B Lab engaged with this tension, or what we describe as a paradox between these two goals of growth and authenticity, the more we dug into the record about how they'd engaged it, the more we were struck about how they had taken a distinctive approach of continuously moving back and forth between these two objectives. One moment pursuing growth, the next moment pursuing authenticity, and kind of ping-ponging, if you will, back and forth and being consistently inconsistent is one way to summarize how they approached it. And what we argued through that research is that they were able to, through being consistently inconsistent, they were able to both maintain the vision behind the movement while also growing the scale of the movement. So overcoming either of these kind of traps.
Interestingly, I learned that one of the main folks driving the criticism that led to the sort of breakdown a little bit of Fair Trade USA and Fair Trade was actually Dr. Bronner's. They had been really upset that I think Nestle had got into, or I'm not sure if it was Nestle, but able to get Fair Trade certified, and they sort of created an offshoot and were more supporting Fair for Life. So I thought that was interesting little tidbit about, that relates to how they've felt about the B Corp movement over the last 18 months or so.
Yes.
Dr. Bronner also left the B Corp certification recently and maybe making similar claims about the B Corp movement. So it may also tell us that our story is not complete, but it's an ongoing battle. And I think what's really interesting about B Corp movement is that they are still on the verge of being, either co-opted or being marginalized. But it seems like at least our data suggests that they are conscious about these pitfalls and they are constantly making efforts to change themselves. So I think that's what really differentiates the B Corp movement, at least until now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but at least until now, that's what differentiates B Corp movement from, I think, other movements.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious if you think too, or at least have you seen in your research, this difference between sort of co-optation and dilution, and in the paper you use the difference between expansion and purity. Does that tension have to exist? Is that like unavoidable in any values-driven business movement that, is looking for success?
Todd, what do you think?
I think it is unavoidable because you can't grow without increasing the diversity of the membership in the movement. And as soon as you do that, there is this question of what is the authenticity of what have we lost by doing that? As your community, any group, as it expands, it will change. And so that question of the continuity is inevitably questioned. But at the same time, and this comes back to the paradoxical management that B Lab demonstrated, it may not be possible to maintain a movement that is entirely focused on purity or on authenticity. That's a challenging proposition to keep that going. I was thinking of like some community cults or something like that. Like what happened to the Shakers? Where are all the Shakers today? I think this tension is inherent between these two goals. But again, there could be different, movements can stake out a different position, can value these different poles differently. And for some movements, like that is the main goal, is to build like a very unified community and emphasize purity or vice versa. But from the perspective that we develop, we see that as being limited, and either of those being limited in their ability to transform the broader market.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in our mind, it's really inevitable challenge for any efforts to achieve systematic transformation, that large scale transformation, right? You're trying to change things. So you should like stay true to your original kind of mission, but at the same time, you're trying to change the system. So at some point, you have to pass the tipping point of changing the whole economy, the whole market, the entire system. And these two are not always aligned with each other. And oftentimes they're in conflict with each other, right? When you're trying to be mainstream, you are constantly being exposed to this co-optation pressure, right? The mainstream will try to convert you to be part of the existing mainstream. And it's at the same time, you need to really maintain your original mission, stay true to the authentic mission. So we thought paradox is such a good concept to capture this relationship between these two, right? The growth and authenticity are in contradiction to each other, but at the same time, you need both for a successful systematic transformation. So it's like yin and yang and the paradox. So it's hard, but at the same time, it's really important for movements to keep those two continuously going with each other.
And I think one thing I wanted to add on, if I could, is that, Suntae was saying earlier, like, we don't know what will happen with the B Corp movement in the future. Like, it could still be co-opted or it could still be marginalized. That's inevitable. That's one of the deep insights of this paradox perspective that Wendy Smith and a lot of great scholars have put together, is that there's this enduring tension that can never be resolved. They'll never say like, okay, now this movement has solved this problem and it's fixed for all time. These two competing demands will always be there. And the B Lab or a movement like that will always have to negotiate that tension.
And Todd, do you find in your research, I'm not sure if you actually, did you speak to folks at B Lab when you were writing this as well? Because my question would be, was this a strategy that B Lab was doing, or did they kind of stumble into it? Like, well, this just happens to work. So that's helpful. Yeah, what do you think, Todd?
Well, we relied on, this was actually, as I mentioned earlier, this was the end result of a very long investigation. So we didn't actually start thinking about what was happening inside B Lab until like 3/4 of the way through this like 10-year journey or something. Not a 10, I forget how many years it was, but what we relied on was the rich set of archival documents we were able to gather about B Lab's process for engaging with this tension. Things like they were putting out a lot of reports about how to integrate multinationals. They were putting out different like annual reports that touched on this tension and things like that. So we were able to compile, I think, news articles, like several hundred documents about this. And yeah, this wasn't actually our idea setting out in the research. This was really something we discovered from studying this corpus of documents from B Lab, that they had actually, in general, had beautifully articulated this paradox perspective in their thinking, that they were continually recognizing this tension in so many different ways, going back actually even to the founding vision that we need to change capitalism and we need to demonstrate a better way to do things. We need credibility, but we also, we need this broader system change. It can't just be like a small group of companies. And that paradox vision or paradox management perspective was articulated throughout a lot of the critical documents around how to handle multinational companies and things like that, that you would just see this language over and over again, that we do have these competing tensions, and like exploring, like, how are they competing? Like really kind of honoring or reflecting on the challenges, on the tensions, but also paying close attention to where the different goals can actually support each other, so that by being more credible, we'll have a bigger influence on the economy. And by having a bigger influence on the economy, we'll create more opportunities for credible organizations, and a variety of other efforts that they made to implement this paradoxical vision and align the competing goals.
Yeah, so to add on what Todd just said, we don't believe that paradoxical management per se was their like conscious strategic choice from the beginning. At least that's our evidence suggests, because when we actually gave a talk on this paper to B Corp all hands meetup in 2024 or something, a couple of years ago, and many of the participants mentioned that we didn't call it paradox, but you guys gave us the word that describes what we have been doing without being very conscious about it. And what our data suggests is that this maybe emergent, not fully strategic management of paradox, I think really came from B Lab's responsiveness to competing voices within the movement. So going back to our like earlier focus, right? We found that in the early cohorts of B Corps, they included this conflictual voices. Like some are trying to really grow really big and change the system. Some are saying this is for authenticity. This is to preserve, maintain our authenticity. And what we notice from our data analysis, and we are still noticing that from our analysis of more recent B Lab behaviors, is that they're very responsive to what member B Corps are saying. Even when the member B Corps are saying contradictory things, they are trying to handle these competing voices. And I think paradoxical management really was an emergent result out of that effort of trying to be responsive.
I think that really tracks, because I don't think that B Lab was not open to feedback before recently. And I think we could point to the pandemic 2020 as a time that B Lab started listening more to member feedback, but also that coincides with when the new standards were starting to get developed, and B Lab was actively asking a lot more than in the past, and now has all these incredible data points to reflect the very contradictory opinions and feelings and desires of the member B Corps. I think what's also interesting is that 2020 also marks a statistically significant increase in the diversity of types of, like, not just big versus little, but firms that are owned by all different kinds of people and around the world. And so I think, maybe it wasn't quite as intentional of a strategy, but it does reflect the data that they have been actively collecting and increasingly collecting as of late.
Yeah, and the secret that we can reveal here is that we are actually looking into that process. So we got
Fun.
the part of the research fellowship that B Lab created, Todd and I, and our stellar doctoral student, Alyssa Menz at Yale. And we are looking actually into this process of standard overhaul, the evolution of standards. That's what they call it. And we're really seeing this process of seeking feedback and trying to process the feedback and getting back to the stakeholders and proposing the draft and gets feedback again. So that's what I think what I meant by interactional process. I know, Emmy, you were going to ask a question about it. So that interactional process is really prominent in that data.
Very cool. Todd, could you give us a sort of more concrete example of what you all are calling, what you're saying, relaxing yet strengthening the standards? What, according to your research, got relaxed and what is getting stronger?
Yeah, so it's really impressive, again, how consistently inconsistent they were over time. And it goes back to this major decision that didn't get that much attention or controversy, as far as we could tell at the time, looking from the outside. But this major decision to admit Ben & Jerry's was the first subsidiary of a multinational company. And my thinking about it anyways, is this was a major move towards expansion, because one of the critical aspects of the rigor and credibility of the B Corp movement was that it's the entire company. It's the holistic entire company that's certified. And so this was a major move to facilitate expansion. And, of course, a great company to start that process with was Ben & Jerry's. That was a major move towards expansion. But then at the very same time, they were taking actions to preserve the rigor or purity of the movement by requiring strict operational and legal independence of subsidiaries. And I think maybe that's something, Emmy, that you worked a lot with. And from what I've heard is a lot of companies ran afoul of that.
Well, I think a lot of companies didn't quite understand what the impact to their certification would have if they would merge or acquire, or if they are a subsidiary, and what kind of subsidiary, or wholly owned, partially, majority owned, partially owned, that type of thing. But yeah.
Yeah. And they made, of course, the strict rules on who could use the B Corp brand and logo. It could only be the certified subsidiary, not the parent. But then part of that also, another big move towards expansion with that was one of the critical elements of credibility was having the stakeholder governance, the stakeholder legal form, whether that's benefit corporation or some equivalent in an LLC and so forth. But that doesn't translate over to a subsidiary. So that was a major point of relaxing the standards, you could say. But then at the same time, they moved to make the standards more rigorous by requiring public disclosure, the full disclosure of the BIA responses for multinational companies and their subsidiaries, having a stronger review of the BIA responses, disclosing sensitive issues, but then allowing some of that to be redacted where critical issues came up. As larger multinationals became certified, they have so many different subsidiaries and operators. This was moving further down in time. Ben & Jerry's, that was 2012. And then in 2016, 2018, they organized a committee about how to integrate multinationals and public companies and how to work with these complex structures. So they made some moves to relax the standards. They had to assess 95% of the entire company, as opposed to 100% of the entire company. So that, it's like in one way, it seems like a very small move, but it's still a move towards expansion. And they allowed greater time to assess newly acquired units, which is a big deal in the multinational world. There's so much M&A happening. But then at the same time, they're making more requirements for any parts of the company that were exempt or not performing up to par on the standards. They had to demonstrate improvements. Those parts of the company were excluded from using the B Corp logo. And then they created additional standards and requirements that these larger companies had to meet. So again, these are just some of the details, but it's this continual moving back and forth in both directions for every step to facilitate the expansion and inclusion of multinationals. There's a step in the other direction of how do we make sure that we're maintaining the credibility and rigor of the movement.
Yeah, it's really the attention to the details that really amazed us. They were making changes that were not really visible to a lot of outsiders and external observers, but they are making these small changes, constantly making these changes to, sometimes they move towards expansion, sometimes then move towards the authenticity. So they keep going back and forth between two poles. And yeah, it's this detailed, the changes were quite impressive.
We have experienced that as consultants. B-Lab. Tweaking the rules behind the scenes and not saying anything. But yes, it's all in spirit of, rigorous standards and higher expectations for companies that have greater responsibility, for sure.
I will say that it's helpful to actually hear you reflect some of that stuff, Todd, around, because I think the perception maybe amongst a lot of the community when, say, allowing multi-net, Ben and Jerry's, it's like the perfect thing to do first, right? Because everyone's like, oh yeah, of course, they have an independent board, but it can be a slippery slope from there because everything's a little less clear. Because if I were to say, these are some like older examples, but like Laureate Education is like a large private for-profit education company that is no longer a B Corp, but was controversial somewhat at the time. It was just like, that's interesting. But usually folks would see that company or that thing and be like, how are they in? But then would discount all the things that you just mentioned, which are like the tightening of the standards. Those things would almost be like invisible. And the fact that you let the company in would be the main thing. Does that resonate with you and what you saw in the research, Todd?
Yeah, so this earlier era that we were researching, again, I mentioned this briefly with the Ben & Jerry's, is that from the outside, as controversial as some of these ideas might seem, from the outside, the controversy hadn't really appeared. As the way, we can reflect now in more recent times, it's really become very salient and public controversy around some of this stuff more recently. So that was something that we were kind of stumped by when we were conducting this research, is like, shouldn't there be more controversy about this? And why can't we find the controversy about it? Because this podcast didn't exist at the time. So we didn't have that data source to rely on.
Yeah, I agree with Todd. B Corp movement itself has been growing a lot, right? It started as just a handful of companies in the United States, and now we're talking about thousands of companies across the world. So a lot of actions that the B Lab took didn't really catch public attention in the early days. That's why I think through our data analysis, we're also very surprised. Oh, B Lab did this, B Lab did that. Oh, that was not really visible to public eyes. But as Todd mentioned earlier, the controversy, if there's a controversy, it now becomes a lot more amplified. It's more visible and audible in the public arena. So people pay more attention. And that's, I think, what's happening with all the, the Dr. Broners, and also with the certification of Nespresso recently. There was a letter of, I think, complaints by some of the B Corp members, right? So I think B Corp is getting into a more challenging period where, they're now more publicly visible. So these controversies will be getting more attention, and B Lab and B Corp movement's action will also become more visible by the public. So it's a good thing for us as a researcher, because we'll get more data points, but at the same time, I think it can be more challenging for B Lab and those who are leading the movement.
But also more impactful or empowering. I think that's a key insight coming from this research that Suntae and I have done, is that it's having a diverse movement and being responsive to the diversity of opinions that's enabled B Lab to effectively manage these tensions. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe B Lab would prefer if the opinions are voiced through a survey form instead of a public-facing letter. But having these different perspectives is so important for B Lab and shaping the trajectory of the movement. I guess that's what's troubling to me about the exit of Dr. Bronner's from the movement, is that their voice is so valuable, but will they no longer have that influence on the movement by ultimately exiting?
Yep. And maybe, Suntae, in this exploration of multinationals, is there a way that you found or a test of whether a large company's entry is helping the movement versus hollowing it out? I think it's so subjective, but I'm curious how you might approach that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's an inevitable choice in a way, because this desire to create systematic transformation was embedded in the DNA of the movement. It's something that B Lab founders were talking about from the very beginning. So, in order to get to that tipping point, I think integrating or inviting these large multinational companies is a step that they must take. They cannot really avoid. And what I'm noticing is that they are taking those steps in a very careful manner. Todd talked about this 2016 to 2018, this efforts to kind of overhaul the standards for multinational companies. And also through the recent efforts to overhaul the entire certification standards, they were very careful about how this will apply to large multinational companies. So I don't know the benefit for the movement itself or the response to the inclusion of large companies itself is what determines whether B Lab admits large companies. It's more of the how. I think it's the direction that I think they feel they must take, and it's rather how you take the movement through that journey. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I have a thought about it too, is it's not so important which companies are let in, if you will, but which companies are allowed to stay in.
Ooh, that's a hot take, Todd. What do you think about that?
There's this
Say more
critical
about that.
moment, right, where the Business Roundtable, the huge network of the Fortune 500 type companies in the US, and for decades they had endorsed Milton Friedman's perspective that their job is to return money to shareholders. And then I'm not sure how many years ago it was now, not too long ago.
18, 19.
Yeah, they sent shockwaves through the business press when they announced that they'd had a change of heart and they endorsed stakeholder capitalism. And their job is to return value for all of their stakeholders, and kind of endorsing a lot of B Lab's ideas, the B Corp movement's ideas. And I think B Lab, B Corps, they had a great response. They took out an ad, and I don't know if it was the New York Times or some newspaper like that, and said like, welcome, roll up your sleeves, like get to work, basically. And since then, there's been quite a bit of critical research that's come out that said the people that signed this letter, the different Fortune 500 type companies that signed it, aren't living up to those commitments. They're laying off all these workers. They're not actually enacting stakeholder management. And so to me, what's critical, like if you have companies like that are joining the movement, that are committing to these standards, if they're not meeting the standards, they need to be kicked out. So for example, like another example that's coming up in my mind is some of the real leaders in the corporate community on climate were big tech companies. And they had the most ambitious climate plans of anybody, and they were driving the whole energy system towards zero emissions. And Microsoft famously had a net positive goal. They were going to remove all of their historical emissions and become net positive. And now with the race to AI and data centers on, those are all in the wastebasket. So imagine one of those companies was a B Corp. What's critical to me is not whether to let them in or not, but whether they're allowed to stay in if they're not living up to the standards.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are waiting to see what happens with the transition from the version 1.6 standards to the version 2 standards, because to your point of relax but strengthen, like if you're a small company, you might have to address 40 different questions in the new standards. But if you're an extra large company, you have more than 100, 120 questions. And it's things like make your taxes transparent in every industry you operate in. It's just like the transparency and requirements are huge for a lot of the large companies. So it will be interesting to see if we have a sort of, I wouldn't say there's been a wave of multinationals, but I think just Nespresso being a very famous one, and then a couple others that are part of the community, it will be very interesting to see if they can make the transition to the new standards.
I totally agree with that 100%. The stuff that we studied unfolding going back to 2012 and 2016, 2018, that all of those relaxed but strengthened have been turned up, maximized. That whole approach has been maximized, turned to 11 with the new standards that are much more rigorous for the largest companies than they are for the smallest companies. Yeah, so I think, to me anyways, that's my take on it, is that this is epitomizes this idea that we are going to scale, we are going to create pathways to scale, but we're going to do it in a way that demands really important transformative even changes. Like, what multinational is disclosing their country by country tax payments is not just making these climate transition plans, but is doing it to scope 3 and is doing it to science aligned and is actually following through on it and holding them to that, even as distractions or other setbacks arise.
I think it's also very interesting, this sort of question of who we're letting in, and what you're saying, Todd, is who we're allowing to stay. And I think it brings up something that has been core to the B Corp movement since the beginning and might not get the credit it deserves, which is that the standards have been evolving this whole time, and the standards have been evolving to be more rigorous over time with every single version change and version shift. And continuous improvement has always been encouraged in the B Corp movement, and now it is required. And so I think that's a really powerful point, is there's the recertification, and like you have to very much opt in to recertification as a B Corp, but there's also these other mechanisms for B Lab to theoretically kick companies out. There are these like robust complaint structures for all kinds of stakeholders to be able to submit complaints. And then they have a whole series of committees and people that are constantly reviewing this data, and the controversial industries that B Corps are a part of in some direct or indirect way. There are mechanisms to revoke a B Corp certification status too. So I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, and also I just wanted to add that this new standards, the big change was moving away from this 80 score, threshold from BIA to this, as Ryan mentioned earlier, for some companies, more than 100 minimum requirements. So that really kind of bans some large corporations to be certified if they're doing really good on certain aspects of sustainability, but they're not really doing well for other aspects of sustainability. So this overhaul, I think, is one other B Lab's attempt to strike that balance. They are trying to, incorporate these large corporations, but they're very careful in their approach. And through our analysis of that process of developing that standards, we were able to see that B Lab was really trying hard not to alienate small and medium-sized B Corps that are, the core part of the movement. So I think it's another evidence that they are still trying to do paradoxical management.
Why do you think that the B Corp movement has not folded in the same way that other movements have? What are some of the key design features that gave it resilience? Maybe Suntae, you first.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, before this interview, I had a time to reflect on that. And also, I think it's the B Labs. I know a lot of B Corps and a lot of stakeholders around the movement have, their own problems and complaints about B Lab. But I think what's really salient, at least from our analysis and our own experiences, is that the core of the movement is not really like top down or directive, but they're very responsive and open to different voices. And I think that's what, again, enabled the B Corp movement to address these conflicting demands in a paradoxical manner and prevented the movement from falling into either marginalization or co-optation.
And there's a deeper story to that too, that goes back to Suntae's interactional processes, that that he loves, which is that, and this question of like, was it intentional or not? And the larger research behind the HBR, that's where we started from again, is that these early B Corps, they're joining with these different complaints. And some of them are mad about shareholder capitalism, and some of them are mad about CSR, phony CSR stuff. So that's how we end up framing that research, is that there's a historical back and forth between incumbent large corporations and these market alternative movements. And that earlier market alternative movements like organic and fair trade, they started in a simpler landscape. Some of them have really deep histories, but like more modern histories in the 1970s and so forth. And at that time, it was much more simple. Like companies were just doing bad stuff. They didn't have CSR departments. The market systems are broken and we're going to come up with alternatives. So it was really a focus on expansion. There was none of this constituent, that wasn't as strong of a voice maybe in those movements to maintain purity. It was more about, we need to change the broken system. And then over time, large companies responded to that. They saw the success of organic, the fair trade, and other ethical markets, alternative markets, and they responded strategically to co-opt a lot of those ideas and develop CSR, develop their own acquirement of these companies and so forth. And so when the B Lab movement got started in 2006 and onwards, they started in a more complex landscape or moment in time in which these mainstream large companies were moving in both directions. And that's what seeded, from our analysis anyways, that's what seeded or led to the diversity of ideas and perspectives in the B Corp movement. And so we have kind of that argument as well, that there's this sort of structural condition that Suntae, maybe you could elaborate more on how this interaction unfolded, but that's part of it as well, I think.
I agree. Yeah. B Corp movement is really a reflection of the time when they were born. They were born in the time when corporations were strategically multifaceted. Like they were still pursuing shareholder value maximization, but also they were spending money on CSR and stuff like that. So I think that's what makes B Corp movement really interesting. Maybe beyond business sustainability. I'm just making a little bit of leap here, but some of the political challenges that we're facing these days maybe are an outcome of that more complicated social and political environment where people, the liberals are also criticized for not as purely liberal as before. And yeah, so how B Lab and the B Corp movements kind of navigates this changing environment may allow us to see how we should respond to this political and societal crisis that we are facing right now.
One thing I'm curious about is the two of you, since you did this work, you're continuing to do work on the B Corp movement. Are there any other big questions that you're holding around the B Corp movement that you would want to see addressed going forward? Maybe Suntae, I don't know if anything comes up for you, or if you'd ask Todd.
Yeah, B Corp movement is alive. And unlike other alternative movements that we discussed earlier, I think it still has the chance for fundamentally transform the businesses and the market economy. So the big question that I keep thinking about is I really want to see, I'm a supporter. I root for B Lab and the B Corp movement. So B Lab is not everything about the movement as we like, it's the thread throughout this discussion, right? The B Corp movement is really influenced and affected by the member B Corps and all the businesses and entrepreneurs that are trying to, solve the society's problem through the means of business. And that ideal, I think, is healthy and is still well upheld by B Lab and the movement. But then the ultimate aspiration of the B Lab movement, B Corp movement, has not been achieved yet, right? Still, we don't have one single large multinational corporation certified as a B Corp as a whole, right? We don't have that yet. So
now Danone is fully certified across their whole top to bottom. So
that's right. That's right. Yeah, I was thinking more in the American context.
Oh yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So that's an exciting evolution. And I really want to know how the B Corp movement would kind of fundamentally transform market capitalism and populate the world with more good businesses. Todd,
Todd,
please
yeah,
help.
what do you got?
Yeah, I really appreciate this like interactional process perspective and that it's always unfolding and the story is never complete, the story is never finished. You can and you say, oh, they've moved too far in this direction at this moment. But then if you come back, you can see now they've moved in the other direction and it looks different from moment to moment. And that was something I found really exciting about our research was the sense that there's challengers, there's the activists and the B Corps, and they're challenging companies to be better, but then the companies respond. And how is the B Corp movement going to respond to that response? And this interactional process keeps unfolding over time. And so I guess piggybacking off what Suntae was saying, I'm really excited to see how the new standards unfold and how companies respond to them is obviously a super burning question for everybody in the B Corp movement. Suntae and I are, and with Alyssa mentioned, we're digging deeper into the historical process behind the evolution of standards. So that's something we're curious about is to understand at a more granular level, like how this type of paradoxical management is orchestrated or achieved and what the implications are of that for change management and other topics. So there's no end to interesting things to think about with the B Corp movement, that's for sure.
Any findings that you're willing to throw out there pre-publication?
Yeah, it's great that we don't have to get past the reviewers.
Yeah.
I think just what came up already, seems really valuable to mention again. It's just we definitely see this process of moving back and forth, of listening to a lot of often conflicting perspectives and trying to find a way that recognizes these conflicting perspectives, that deeply shaped the whole process and the end result. And when you look across the different issues, the different impact topics in the new standards and the different sub-requirements and some of the other issues that arose throughout the process, like the transition away from the old BIA scoring model and things like that. When you get into the weeds of the process, it's very much about trying to reconcile these inconsistent perspectives. So that's what we're focused on is understanding that at a more granular level. How did that work? The different kinds of solutions that arose from the different ways that those tensions were recognized.
Yeah, just to add one more thing there. So we are really early stage of analysis. So we're at the stage where we don't have the movie itself, but we can think of what the trailer may look like. So that's one big aspect of the trailer that I want to highlight is the meaning of their work. Like taking one step back and think about what it means to overhaul B Corp certification standards. It's a really ambitious work because they are really trying to define what a good business is in this changing world. And that's what they did in the beginning of the B Corp movement. And from 2020, they are facing this rapidly changing environment and they are trying to redefine, right? Redefine what a good business is in today's world. And they are trying to achieve that not by just thinking about themselves or having discussion among themselves, but opening up to hundreds and thousands of feedback. And we're dealing with all that data. And it's an ambitious work. So I think it's worth studying. And I think this is a good trailer for our study.
Very exciting. We're looking forward to it for sure.
Thank you.
I think what's interesting about having a podcast, and I think folks who run into me in real life will hear me express my anxieties about how a podcast episode just offers a snapshot in time. And especially when we're trying to cover something like the B Corp movement that is shifting so significantly over time, I get in my head a little bit about this is going to be less accurate in a year or something like that. But I really appreciate that you all are offering a framework of how to analyze a movement like this. And I think that what Todd was saying was the pendulum can swing sort of back and forth. It can swing towards strengthening versus relaxing or diluting versus co-opting. And I think that the version 2 standards are a really interesting and very clear and significant example of trying to bid for that purity that we're talking about in your research. And so, yeah, I'm excited to see what happens with these standards. And I think I'm also excited to hear more about your research on the evolution of the standards. And yeah, I think we're going to wrap, but we like to ask our guests, all of our guests, what do you need right now? And where can listeners learn more about your work? Maybe we'll start with Todd.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate this conversation. And I am a serve with Be Local Philly. So I've got a shout out to all the Be Locals. These are amazing communities. I've really enjoyed being a part of it. And it's an amazing venue or opportunity to connect with B Corps in a region. So wherever your B Local is, that would be great to be a part of. And I know B Academics is the other big one to mention. I know you've had other B Academics people here, but from the university side, it's an amazing network of academics that are fascinated about B Corps. And one of the big reasons I started doing this B Impact Clinic, which was a model kind of developed and popularized by the B Academic networks, where groups of students run projects to help companies certify, recertify, learn from the standards. One of the big reasons I started doing it was because I wanted to give back to B Corps. As academics, we're always studying people, we're taking information from them, and we're gaining through our publications ourselves. But I know many B Corps feel, especially historically, like there's so many researchers that want things from them because this movement is so fascinating. That's why brought me to do that B Impact Clinic. So I guess that would be something to throw out there. Like, there's probably universities in your area where there are B Academics, people who are interested in collaborating with companies on projects. The last thing I'll throw out there is GACA 2.1b. This is such an exciting thing for me and for all academics, I think. In that same vein, GACA 2.1b, the company contributes to external research to advance social or environmental impacts. And so again, I'm so excited that now maybe we can actually help B Corps certify, recertify by collaborating with them on research projects. So yeah, think about that as an opportunity. And, I have a website at Temple University. I have a website there, and I have an email address, which is my name, todd.schifeling@temple.edu, and I'm on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and just to clarify for folks who are listening and don't yet know, Todd is referring to GACA 2.1b and also I think 2.3b or something like that are options to fulfill the government affairs and collective action requirement for B Corps who are certifying and recertifying. So take a look. And yes, the academic research is very much a part of the options to fulfill that, which is exciting. Suntae?
Oh, I think Todd already covered all the territories that I wanted to mention. And the only thing is that you asked us to additional resources. So if you want to learn more about our research or specifically what B Corp or B Corp movement did for paradoxical management, always refer to our academic paper, which is much longer and much more boring, but there are a lot of good AI tools that can summarize the paper for you. So you can always just reach out to us, email me or Todd if you want us to share the research. Yeah, so that's, I think, all that I wanted to say.
The other thing I'll add for folks is that if you are looking to participate in academic research, I think a good starting point is reaching out to B Academics okay, great, yeah. And then they'll point you in the right direction. They often have their finger on the pulse of what folks are thinking about and actively writing, and they're a great, great resource for trying to jump in somewhere.
Well, thank you so much, Todd and Suntae, and we'll have you back on the show when your new report is published.
In the fullness of time.
Yeah. Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lyft Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.